Let me ask you to turn in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 to 32. And while you're turning there, I want to talk with you for just a few moments, just kind of face to face here. We made a really exciting announcement last week at the end of the service about the change in our broadcast ministry to go fully digital. And after that announcement has had a week to sink in, I just want to maybe try to run ahead of any questions that might be percolating out there. First of all, I want you to know that this decision was not a quick decision. In fact, it's been on my radar for just about 2 years. 2 years ago, I was the associate pastor, just a member of the staff here, and I spent, in fact, it was 2 years ago this month. And I'd spent several weeks looking at a lot of data about our church, looking at attendance figures, looking at giving figures over the last 15, 20 years. And I went to the leadership and I just said, hey, look, we are 2 years out from a really predictable financial constriction in the life of our church, and we have to prepare for that. And so one of the things you have to do is you have to turn around decline. And we are working really hard on that. You're going to hear some more about that. It's some exciting things going on that I'm looking forward to sharing with you here in a couple of months on the backside of the summer. But until you can turn decline around, you have to make economies. You just can't spend money you don't have. I've made a commitment to you regularly that I will not spend money that we don't have, and I appreciate that. But you don't have to clap. It's not a magic trick. It's just a mathematical fact. Money won't let you spend it if you don't have it. That's kind of the way it works. And so I want to let you know that behind this decision, there is a practical reality and a principled reality. So the practical reality is we can't spend money that we don't have. And the reality is we don't have $500,000 a year to spend the way we used to. So just to give you one little snapshot on our broadcast ministry, the Sunday morning slot for broadcast, that costs us $225,000 to have our Sunday morning slot, and it reaches 9,000 people. That's a lot of money and not a lot of people, particularly given the fact that those people aren't here. The reality is we just don't have the practical ability to do that anymore. So that's just the practical, hard and fast reality. One of the things that I tell our staff is that one of my jobs is to be the custodian of reality and just to look at you and tell you the truth. And just like you don't in your home, you have all sorts of things that you want, but you have to regulate what you get based on what you can afford. I have to do that here at our church, and I'm just telling you, we have to make economies right now. There's also a principled reality, and the principled reality is that for just under $500,000, we're reaching about 35,000 people. For less than 1% of that, we can reach more than 100 times that. So here's another thing that you can just know about me. I think this has been clear up to this point, but I think it'll prove itself truer and truer, that if you give me an opportunity to reach more people with less money, I will do that. And this is an opportunity for us to reach more people with less money, and we have to do it. Now, here's what I know. I know that this is going to be a change that's going to make it hard for people that we care for in the life of our church, members of our congregation who can't be here. We've been working for months on a plan to reduce the impact on those people. Our hospital pastors are working a plan to go around and visit our folks and let them know about how they can use their equipment to receive our services. We have brochures printed up to give them. They don't have to write anything down. They don't have to remember anything. We're going to show them how to do it right there with them and give them something that they can remember. If you know people who benefit from the television ministry, I want to let you know that we're happy to make those brochures and that information available to you so that you can be part of serving our body, and in particular those people who can't be here. But this is really an opportunity for more people to hear about the saving gospel of Jesus Christ. It's not an opportunity for less to hear about it. And the reality is, what it means to be Christians alive in the world means we are not allowed to choose to reach less people for more money. We are stewards of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and we have to get it out to the maximum number of people, and this decision represents that commitment. There's another principled reality. There is a way to do broadcast ministry in a way that makes money. It can make a lot of money. We have not been doing it that way over the years, but there's a way to do it that way. And quite frankly, as we've taken a long time to figure out what's going to happen with broadcast, we had a lot of national figures that flew in here, and they said, hey, look, the people on radio and television right now, they're aging out of their ministries. Their ministries are coming to an end, and I'm just going to tell you, they said, we think that you guys can fill the gap, and we want you to do it. And here's how much money you can make. And you can make a lot of money doing it. But there is a significant cost. And let me tell you what the costs are. First of all, the costs are millions of dollars up front that we don't have. Secondly, it takes 5 years to start making money. And the third thing is when these people fly in and they come into my office and they've got their presentations and they've got the pictures up on the screen and they're saying, we want you to be the guy that takes the trips to Israel, and we want you to be the guy that leads the cruise ship deal, and we want you to be the guy to fly to North Carolina and meet with the pastors and go to the radio luncheon and the TV luncheon. And essentially what it is it has me being here on Sunday morning preaching for cameras and microphones, and then leaving on an airplane to go raise money and host events all over the country and all over the world. And my calling is not to be a national or an international television and radio Bible preacher. My calling is to be here as the pastor of this church, and there is no possible way for me to pastor this church on the phone. And so I made a decision that even though there's gold in them there hills, it's 5 years away, and it requires me to do a job that is different than what you pay me to do. And so the answer to doing it was no, and that's because we want to share the gospel of Jesus Christ with this city. I want to shepherd and care for you, and that means that I need to be here. So that is some of the practical, and I appreciate that. That's some of the very practical and principled reasons behind it. One really important thing that we need to do, because talking about the broadcast and the media ministry gives us an opportunity to do something that we don't often get the opportunity to do. The people who work in the media and broadcast ministry are incredible servants, and you hardly ever see them. At 3 booths in this room and behind those walls back there, you hardly ever get to see these people in their offices as they edit and work, but they serve faithfully, they serve hard. They're going to continue to do that as we continue to project what happens in here. But it's right that we take an opportunity where we're thinking about broadcast and we're thinking about digital outreach, that we show appreciation to all the men and women who work for hours and hours and hours to be sure that people out here hear the gospel. So we're grateful for you guys. Thank you. Now, here's the most important thing. You can't count any of that against my time for the sermon. All right, so come on now, you got to cut me some slack. All right, that was a whole lot of extra minutes, and it was all free. So I'm going to hit the clock now, okay? So now's when it starts. All right. Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 to 32. Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 to 32. We're looking at the Sermon on the Mount. And in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus Christ is telling us how we have to live our lives. He is instructing us about what it means to be a member of His kingdom. And today we're going to see that in this section of the sermon, He tells us how to live our lives with regard to sexual purity. And this is what God says. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out and throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand makes you stumble, cut it off and throw it from you. For it's better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. It was said, "Whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce." But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we are thankful for Jesus Christ. And Father, as everyone in this room comes as a sinner before the perfect throne of grace, where sits our matchless Christ, we are asking for the mercy that is required to hear these hard words. And we are begging for the mercy that is required to measure up to these words. Give us both in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. We're going to take a couple of weeks to look at this text. And in this first week, in this part one, I want us to see the lay of the land about marriage and adultery. One of my favorite things about the Bible is that it will often use powerful word pictures to describe glorious realities in the kingdom of heaven. There's a wonderful, glorious word picture that is used to describe the sexual relationship in marriage. And we find it in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 4. It says, "Marriage is to be held in honor among all, and the marriage bed is to be undefiled, for fornicators and adulterers God will judge." That's some strong medicine in that verse, but in the midst of the strong words, there is a glorious word picture. And the word picture is the marriage bed. The marriage bed is a glorious and a good, a wonderful and a marvelous gift. The word picture takes the activity and describes the activity by saying where it happens. So the location is meant as a reference to the event that happens in the location. And so when the Bible says the marriage bed, it's a beautiful, modest way to describe the glorious and delightful realities that happen in the marriage bed. The marriage bed is a sweet and a delightful place. Wonderful things happen in the marriage bed. But the delights of the marriage bed only happen when that place is protected. And so there is a very high wall of protection that surrounds the marriage bed to be sure that what happens in that bed is sweet and beautiful and fun and delightful and not poisonous and deadly. And the high wall that surrounds the marriage bed is this principle in the Bible. It is one man and one woman for one whole life. One man and one woman for one entire life. Now, if you pay attention to the news in 21st century America, or if you take a walk in your neighborhood, you will know that that is probably the most controversial thing I could say in front of you. One man and one woman for one whole lifetime. But that is the wall that protects the marriage bed and makes it sweet. Jesus in these verses talks about adultery. And you adulterate something when you corrupt it through addition. Something is adulterated when you add something to it that corrupts the purity of it. So you can corrupt gold by adding dross. You can corrupt chili by adding noodles. You corrupt the marriage bed by adding someone into it that doesn't belong there. Adultery happens when this glorious marriage bed is corrupted through the violation of the principle of one man and one woman for one whole life. And that sounds easy enough to understand, but what Jesus does, as he does throughout the Sermon on the Mount, is he blows our minds. And he says, you are guilty of adultery way more often than you think you are. And in fact, what we're going to do as we look at these verses for the next few moments is we're going to see Jesus' teaching that there are actually 4 ways that you can commit adultery. And the first way is the most obvious. It's the one we're tempted to think of most regularly. You can commit adultery with a sinful sexual act. Jesus says, you've heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. Jesus quotes the 7th commandment, and he doesn't do anything to back off of it. He doesn't say it's wrong. Jesus stands on the teaching of the Old Testament that marriage is the union of one man and one woman for one whole life, and nobody else is allowed over that wall into the marriage bed. It is sinful. It is foolish. There are people in this room, and you think you can bring anybody into that bed that you want. You think it is yours to do what you want with, and Jesus Christ, not me, says no. You don't get to do anything you want in that bed. You don't get to bring anybody you want into that bed. Everything in the Bible that talks about this screams how foolish the whole thing is. The wise man in Proverbs will say, the man who commits adultery lacks sense. He doesn't have any brains in his head. He's going to get wounds and dishonor and disgrace. He's like a bird that flies into a trap, and he doesn't know that it's going to cost him his life until an arrow pierces his liver. You're going to die. Jesus stands on every bit of that teaching, and he says it to you here this morning who are fooling around with all the people you're fooling around with. You're doing something with the marriage bed that you're not allowed to do. You're corrupting it by bringing someone there that doesn't belong there. And God brings his judgment in that situation. But that's not the only way to commit adultery. Jesus doesn't stop there. He says, the most obvious, yeah, you can commit adultery with a sinful sexual act, but you can also commit adultery with sinful sexual desire. We're not talking about behavior now. We're not talking about what human eyes can see. We're talking about what's going on the inside where nobody can see except God himself. Jesus says, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Jesus takes the 7th commandment, not to commit adultery, and he ties it obviously to the 10th commandment, not to covet your neighbor's wife, and he puts them right there together. And he says that when you look at a woman you're not married to, and you want to sin with her, when you look at a man that you're not married to, and you want to sin with him, you have already committed adultery in your heart. Jesus says, maybe you're laying there in the marriage bed with your wife or your husband, and if anybody walked in, all they'd see is a faithful marriage. All they'd see is two people who look like they're loving one another. But Jesus says you can bring somebody into the marriage bed in your mind. You can bring somebody into the marriage bed that doesn't belong there by wishing they were there. Jesus says you're guilty. You're an adulterer. There's no maybe even outward evidence. But God doesn't just look as man looks. He looks deep down inside at your heart, and he knows that you want something that he says is not true and not good and not holy and not right. And you corrupt the marriage bed by adding someone in your mind. And you're guilty. God's judgment comes on that. So listen to me. If you're sitting here this morning and you're tempted to talk about all the things you've never not done. Well, I've never actually been with a woman I'm not supposed to be, or I've never actually been with a man I'm not supposed to be. Jesus says, look in your heart. Look what you want. Look at your lustful looks. Look at how you stare at that picture on Instagram. Jesus says your internet history proves you're guilty of adultery. Jesus says the messages that you send on Facebook prove you're guilty of adultery. Jesus says those text messages on your phone and the pictures that you've sent back and forth to one another are evidence that you are an adulterer, even if you've never shared your bed with someone. You have corrupted the marriage bed by adding someone in your mind. And Jesus says you're guilty. But that's not all. You can commit adultery with a sinful sexual act. You can commit adultery with sinful sexual desire. You can commit adultery, 3, with a divorce. You can commit adultery with a divorce. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 31 to 32, Jesus says, it was said, whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. He's looking at these Jewish leaders who looked back at the Old Testament law that was intended to regulate practice of divorce, and they were using that as permission that divorce was good. And so many of them were walking away from their wives for any and every reason. And Jesus says, you might have heard that, but verse 32, here's what I say to you. Everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity, makes her commit adultery. Jesus isn't talking about here whether divorce is ever right or ever wrong. We'll get to that much later. Jesus is talking about who is guilty of adultery. And here's Jesus' third area of guilt. He says, if you're married, if you share the marriage bed with someone and you get out of it and walk away, and later, after you've walked away in divorce, that person that you were married to, if they fill up that vacancy with someone else, they commit adultery because it's one man, one woman for one life. They commit adultery. And here's what Jesus says, you share in the guilt for that adultery because the vacancy they filled up was created by you. Jesus says you're guilty of adultery if you divorce someone and therefore create a situation where they fill up your vacancy with someone else. Now, Jesus says there's an exception to this. Remember, he's trying to assign responsibility for adultery. Who's guilty of this sin? He says, everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity, makes her commit adultery. He says, you're guilty of adultery unless the reason you're not in the marriage anymore is because of unchastity, is because of sexual immorality. He's saying you don't share the guilt for the adultery in that situation because you didn't just create a vacancy, your spouse shoved you out of the bed with another person. So if your spouse brought somebody into the marriage bed and forced you out of it, it's not to say whether the divorce should have happened or not. It's just to say you're not guilty of that adultery because they got the whole thing started. But Jesus says very clearly, you are guilty of adultery, with this one exception, even in a divorce. And then there's a fourth way to commit adultery. You can commit adultery with a marriage. Verses 31 to 32 again. It was said, whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you, that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity, makes her commit adultery. And here it is. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Jesus says, whoever you are, and whatever the story is, if you walk into a marriage bed and fill up a vacancy that was left by somebody else because of divorce, you're committing adultery. Because it's one man and one woman for one whole life. Marriage ends when the life ends of one of the parties in the marriage. And just because somebody made a sinful decision, just because somebody made a wrong decision, does not give any one of us the right to rewrite the rules of the universe. Marriage is what marriage is, regardless of what we do with marriage. It's one man, one woman, for one life. And if you crawl into a spot in the marriage bed that belongs to somebody else, you're an adulterer. Mark chapter 10, verses 11 to 12. Jesus says, whoever divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she herself divorces her husband and marries another man, she is committing adultery. Luke Chapter 16, verse 18. Everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. And he who marries one who is divorced from a husband commits adultery. These words are as hard to hear as they are clear. But they paint a picture of the 4 different ways that the marriage bed can be corrupted through addition. You desecrate the marriage bed by putting someone in it who doesn't belong there. These aren't the words I would write. These aren't the words I would say if it were up to me. I just work here. It's my job to call them as they lie. Here it is. It's hard to hear. The reason it's hard to hear is because it's a word of judgment to every last one of us. It's a word of judgment to the people in the pew. And it's a word of judgment to the preacher too. Because the point is, we've all committed adultery. And we hear that word of judgment and we don't like it. And we want to squirm away and we start looking for good news. We need good news and we preach good news here at First Baptist Church. But we got to preach the real good news. And when you're judged by these words, as I am judged by these words. The temptation is to hear the word of Jesus and say, I don't like it. I never did like that preacher anyway. Never did. And this just proves it. I knew there was a reason I haven't had my devotions in the Sermon on the Mount in a long time, and I never will again, by the way. We look for good news by listening to the words of Jesus and trying to run away. Don't do that. Listen to me, there's no good news in running away from the standard. There's no good news in pretending like the standard doesn't exist. The standard is there, whether you admit it or not. Don't run away from real good news to pursue false good news. The reality is as bad as it sounds. Some of you are sitting out there this morning and you've been living your life and you're going, I'm going to do whatever I want with my bed. And I don't like anybody telling me what to do. I don't like the Bible doing it. I don't like some preacher standing up doing it. I always knew those people down at First Baptist were a big bunch of prudes, and this proves it. Out of here. Listen, the Son of God says you are an adulterer. He writes the rules, not you, and you're guilty. But you say, well, I haven't done that. See, not me. No, no, no. I have never done that. Only had sex in marriage and never brought anybody in from the outside. And Jesus says, well, hold your horses. Have you ever gotten a divorce? And Jesus says, if you've gotten a divorce and created a vacancy in the marriage bed, you share guilt for adultery. You're not off the hook. And you might say, well, I've never done that. I've never divorced anybody. And Jesus says, well, are you or have you ever been married to someone who was divorced? And Jesus says, if you have, you're guilty of adultery. And I can stand up here as the pastor of the church, and I can say I have never done any of those three things. But Jesus has me, dead to rights. Because Jesus says to me and everybody else who hasn't done those three things, have you ever wanted it to be different than it is? Have you ever brought somebody into the marriage bed in your heart? And the answer is yes. And the word from Jesus is you're guilty too. And I'm so sorry for my sin. I'm so sorry for my corruption of the marriage bed. And I say, okay, Jesus, you're the king of the whole universe. I can't run from your words. I can't pretend they don't exist. And so what do? And here's what you do. You let the words of Jesus press you in to the work of Jesus. You see? You're guilty. You're an adulterer. And so am I. And here's the good news. Here's the good news we preach every week. Jesus didn't come for pure people who don't need a Savior. The only people Jesus saves are sinners. Jesus gives His gift of purity to impure people like you and like me. He came and He never sinned. He never wanted to commit adultery. He never tried to. He never mixed up his marriage. He was only always perfect. And He died and bled out and paid for all of the impurity of you and me. Jesus' purity covers your impurity, and He covers mine. That's good news. Don't run from good news because you won't admit you're guilty. Admit you're guilty. And then trust in Jesus Christ that His blood will wash you pure and white as snow. The story is told in John chapter 8 of a sinful woman, an obviously sinful woman. She was guilty of adultery. The text says she was caught in the act. They walked in the room and there she was, right in front of everybody. And they hauled her out of the bed and they dragged her down the street and they threw her in the square. And to test Jesus, they said, a woman who's guilty like this ought to die by stoning. And Jesus does not argue that she's guilty. What He does is He expands the guilt. And He says she's not the only guilty one here. And He says, let the one who is without sin cast the first stone. And he gets down on the ground and he starts to just trace in the sand. And as the story goes on, everybody walks away, everybody. Until there's just two people left. A very guilty woman and a man who is perfect and spotless with infinite innocence. And He says, woman, who's left to condemn you? And she said, no one, Lord. They've all gone away. And the only perfect man in the universe looked at her. And He said, I don't condemn you either. Now go and sin no more. That's the good news. The good news is a room full of adulterers in 21st century Jacksonville, Florida, get to come before a perfect Christ, and by owning their sin and trusting in Jesus' payment for their sin, you get to hear, I don't condemn you either. Go and sin no more. It's Jesus who forgives you. It's Jesus who by his blood and his righteousness gives you strength to, wherever you are today, whatever your story is, ever how you violated these 4 ways to commit adultery, whatever you've done, today Jesus is here to forgive and cleanse and empower you to move forward. And wherever you are today, just be faithful. Be faithful where you are today. Receive his forgiveness today. Trust in him today to give you his own purity. Don't run from the standard. Run to Christ. And you'll find no one to condemn you. You'll find his perfection given to you. And because you have his own perfection by faith, there's not going to be anybody at this church to condemn you either. Certainly not the pastor who needs the same grace you do. Because of Jesus, because of his life and death and resurrection, a room full of guilty, vile adulterers who corrupt our marriage beds by addition can sing with joy and hope and peace and forgiveness.